they've had enough. They're turning to a different way of life.
Anything else before we leave chapter 25 that you'd like to...
Yeah, I'd like to look at 15 and 16 because this is, I think, important in terms of it's something that the Book of Mormon talks about again and again, but the importance of the law of Moses for even people who believe in Christ. In many respects, what we're reading about here is very similar to what Paul taught to the Galatians. The law of Moses was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. And we get that brought out very nicely here in 15 and 16. Yea, they did keep the law of Moses, for it was expedient that they should keep the law of Moses, as yet, for it was not all fulfilled. But notwithstanding that the law of Moses, they did look forward to the coming of Christ, considering that the law of Moses was a type of his coming, believing that they must keep those outward performances until the time that he should be revealed unto them. Now they did not suppose that salvation came by the law of Moses, but the law of Moses did serve to strengthen their faith in Christ, and thus they did retain a hope through faith unto eternal salvation, relying upon the spirit of prophecy which spake of those things to come. The law of Moses was very important to help them come to Christ. It was not just that Moses was a type, but that the law of Moses was a type and taught us something about Christ. And the Nephites understood that, and we get that taught much more clearly in the Book of Mormon than perhaps we do in many places in the Old Testament.
Good point. Perhaps an example of them not looking beyond the mark in what they were supposed to be doing, and yet looking to the mark of what they were coming to and wanting to do as well.
Well, I especially appreciate in the middle of verse 16, the law of Moses did serve to strengthen their faith in Christ. So the idea is that there are some things that be core or central to your salvation. There may be things that don't bring about your salvation, but they help strengthen your faith in Christ.
Yeah. A reminder that I like that comes out of that verse in my mind is that the Old Testament has an awful lot of Christ-centered images and principles, and often in the church it's the one that's kind of least read, and it's such a beautiful transition into the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon helps us to understand the Old Testament much better.
Now we come to chapter 26 and 27 here, and one day it just hit me as I went through this. I noticed that the word joy or rejoice, or a form thereof, is used about 21 times, and so there are other things here too, but amidst all of this is this expression of great joy on the part of Ammon at what the Lord has done, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned here. We can do this and then hit other points, but your feelings. I know there are some. We've got some interaction with how Aaron responds. How do you take what Ammon is doing here in this time of great rejoicing and expressions of joy in these two chapters?
I really like here where he kind of says in verse 2, "Now I ask you, what great blessings he bestowed upon us. Can you tell?" In other words, he's trying to get them to think, this is the end of 14 years. This has been a long time. This has been a hard slog, a very, very difficult time for them. And it's almost like he's saying, okay, pretty much like President Eyring has asked, have you taken time to stop and take account of how much the Lord has blessed us? And it's oftentimes not until we actually sit down and think about those blessings that we realize just how much the Lord is involved in our lives and blessing even in difficult times of our life.
Good point.
Clyde, you mentioned the word count on the word joy here. The way I see that coming at you is this is the equivalent of a really faithful missionary who's giving his missionary homecoming. Now we don't have homecomings anymore, but his talk when he comes back to his ward, and he is just effusive in the feelings of what it feels like to stand there and readdress the faithful ward members, what his mission's done to him, and what kinds of feelings he's felt now as he looks back on it.
Well, and I also like, in a way, he answers his question in verse 3, when he talks about, can you tell what great blessings there have? And this is the blessing which he hath bestowed upon us, that we have been made instruments in the hand of God to bring about this great work. And you think of all the different things he could have said. This is the great blessing that he preserved our lives. This is a great blessing that so many people were baptized. But to him and to his fellow missionaries, the great blessing is that we got to be an instrument. in the hands of the Lord.
And he mentions that again in verse 15 about having been an instrument in the hands of God. And it reminds me of a time when I was younger and I had an oldest son. I didn't own a power drill, go borrow a power drill. And he came back with one of these cordless ones, and I thought, this would be great. I had fairly lengthy screws, and we tried to put those in, and it'd go about halfway, and then it'd kick out. There wasn't enough power. So I sent him back to the neighbors, take this back, ask him if he's got one with a power cord. And we did, and we plugged it into the wall. Well, this had plenty of power, and we could now do the job. In fact, I could break the head off those screws if it was just so powerful. And I thought, this is perhaps sometimes the difference between us as instruments, or when we're in a missionary effort or any calling, that if we try to just rely upon what we've stored up previously and we're not connected to the source, like these young men who were fasting and praying and who were studying the Scriptures and forming their understanding, the Lord could use them as a powerful instrument. So we ask ourselves, what kind of an instrument am I going to be? Am I going to be able to be used by the Lord like these young men were, or is the Lord going to have to fill in and wait for somebody else to come along to do the job because I'm not a very good instrument? But I think that's a really important point.
I think there's something else going on here, that before Ammon ever goes into the mission field, as he's praying, that was his greatest desire. And he uses that same language, that I might go forth and be an instrument in the hands of the Lord. And after 14 years here, he can look back and say, the Lord has blessed me with that opportunity.
You know, with all the young people in the church serving missions and senior couples and everything now, wouldn't it be kind of an aha moment to be in a sacrament meeting when someone's talking and reporting about their mission, and have them make use of the phrase, you know, I just feel like I was an instrument in God's hands. You'd almost want to sit there and just go, oh, Ammon, all over again. Okay.
Well, and one thing that ties into it is, like he says in verse 12, I know that I am nothing. As to my strength, I am weak. If you were to go to a concert and someone played the piano beautifully, at the end of the concert, you wouldn't go up and congratulate the piano.
Yeah.
You would congratulate not the instrument, but the person behind the instrument. Yeah. So if you're an instrument in the hands of the Lord and something great is accomplished, it's kind of hard to take credit for it because you're not the one who actually accomplished it. It was the Lord who accomplished it through you.
In essence, that's what Ammon is saying, is it not, when he speaks to his brother, that I'm not rejoicing in my success, but in what the Lord has done. He acknowledges that.
I love that phrase, Clyde, for in his strength I can do all things. It resonates in so many other places in the Scriptures, but here's our Book of Mormon verse. Think of some of the other places. Isn't Paul the one that says, if God be for us, who can be against us? And then Abraham, is anything too hard for the Lord? And at the announcement of the birth, you know, is with God nothing is impossible. The birth of the Christ child in John. That's just such a great verse. I can do his strength, or in his strength I can do all things.
You know, one of the things that I think Ammon here is thinking as we go, and Alma's going to do the same thing later in chapter 29, but verse 17, who could have supposed that our God would have been so merciful as to have snatched us from our awful, sinful and polluted state, and to be able to use us?
Yeah.
He knew where he was at spiritually, and he knew that it was the mercy of God that enabled him to have a turnaround. And I think that Ammon and his brothers and Alma related to these Lamanites who had had such difficult times, had made poor choices in their lives. But Ammon knew what the atonement of Jesus Christ could do. And so he was willing to go out there and spend 14 years out there because he knew what the atonement did for him, and so wanted to be able to have other people share with that as well.
And it wasn't easy, as 26 verse 29 says here, where they've taught in their houses and their streets and their hills and their temples and their synagogues, and we've been cast out and mocked and spit upon and smote upon the cheek and stoned and bound in strong cords and cast into prison. And yet the whole reason, as he says in verse 30, why did we do all of this and suffer all these afflictions? That we might be the means of delivering or saving some soul. And if we could, then our joy would be full. And that's the joy that's just so full here.
Yeah, I love to point out to those who are thinking of full-time service that missionary work can be quite discouraging, and even some of the greatest scriptural missionaries here, you know, now when our hearts were depressed, they were down. Yeah. You know, President Monson, when we were going through the MTC, spoke to us as missionaries, all fired up and ready to go, and he said, "Now, elders and sisters, you're going to get more discouraged than you've ever been before in your life. It's not a sin to get discouraged. It is to linger in discouragement, but you'll be hit with this." And so I think, you know, it's hard work. Missionary work is.